Welcome, welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And I am here with Dr. Lisa. And before I hand it off to you for the weather, let me just say we had a ridiculous thunderstorm last night. And so I have a lovely branch in my backyard that I need to pull to the side. But otherwise, all property, all persons are safe and sound. So hopefully you did not get that. But I heard it was pretty bad up and down the East Coast because there were a lot of flights delayed or canceled and so forth.
Hmm.
But did you get any of that in
Yeah.
your area of the country?
No, we didn't. It's just windy here, as is usual. But it's pretty nice, 70s today. So I'm actually still in my run outfit from this morning because I haven't had time to change. So I did take advantage of the nice weather this morning and get outside. But it
Yes.
started to get pretty windy this afternoon. So yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
there was a little, storm. I don't even want to call it a storm, just a little sprinkle this afternoon, but nothing major. So anyway, it's been a good day here. But let's dive into this week's episode, specifically the word of the week. And the word of the week is code switch. Code switch. Now, I did not know the deeper roots and origins of the word code switch. All I know, Lisa, is that I have a fabulous hoodie that says too tired to code switch that I love to wear when I'm going to do a training or a presentation about code switching. So there you have it. But I didn't know that the term was originally documented as a linguistic phenomenon. So sociologists, including John Gumpertz, were interested in the circumstances that made dual language speakers switch back and forth between their native language and the one spoken by the majority group around them. But then code switching was quickly noted even in populations that only spoke one language. And so the term grew to encompass a set of behaviors beyond this multilingualism or being a polyglot, if you will. So this could be changing your mannerisms, your tone of voice. I've even read a few things on changing one's hair, which I am guilty of way back in the day when I first started my professional experience. And so I really thought it was interesting that code switching, some people, especially Lisa, as we know, the people that don't have to do it, are unaware that it's happening all around them. But the Urban Dictionary describes it as customizing style of speech to the audience or group being addressed. So a great example of this, Lisa, was when my mom used to work as the teller in the drive-through of the bank for 46 years. And she had her professional bank voice and she had her regular voice on the phone. So I would suggest that that was a great example of code switching over the years. But I'm sure you've also you've heard of this tone as
Hmm.
well, this word as well, and maybe you've interacted with some other people that you noticed were doing it, but may not have been our
Hmm.
place to say that. But I think it's an important word to be aware of.
Yeah, and it is also the name of one of my longtime favorite podcasts from NPR, Code Switch, right, which is about race and culture. But I first encountered that when I came to the US for my study abroad back in 1997. And I noticed I had to change the words that I used and the pronunciation to some degree to be understood and to fit in. So obviously, American English versus British English, but that was where I came across it in that context. But your mom's example reminds me of that movie. What is that movie like? Thank you for calling, and it ultimately ends up with the guy turning into a horse, but he has the white person's voice, right? When he answers the
Uh-huh.
telemarketing phone call. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, so I know I've done it. My mom is a great example of it because I heard it and I knew it by default. I just didn't know that there was a word to describe it. I I don't think I can ever remember a time where that was not the case to use such language. So I appreciate those experiences, but I also know that some of those experiences come out of making sure people are safe in a professional environment. Their job is safe, their personhood is safe, all of that. So just know that there are deeper roots that have grown into what we experience today as code switching. Okay. All right. So, Lisa, let's dive into phase one. I have been dying to talk to you about this particular article that I read in the Atlantic. And it struck me because I have, as you all know, if you've listened to this podcast for more than 5 minutes, you know that I have two sons, but a lot of people don't know that they do have legacy patrilineal names. And so my oldest son is Charles Adam Gold III, named after actually three men in the family. His father, obviously, the second, his grandfather, the first, and then also my father, who is also named Charles. And so it was just almost a no brainer when he was conceived and born that he would probably have the name Charles Adam Gold III. And then with my younger son, interestingly enough, he also has a patrilineal legacy name. Kendrick is a derivation of Kenneth, which is a pretty popular name in the South. But Kenneth is the first person in my family that went off to a four-year college. He's my goodness, great cousin, but first one to go off to a four-year college. Went into the US Army, eventually became a colonel. He is just an icon in the family. Went to Virginia State University at HBCU in his little bug and threw a bunch of stuff in the trunk of his little bug and went off to school and made this big name of himself. And then also my godfather, Kenneth Pennell Sr., and my godbrother, Kenneth Pennell Jr., and his son, Kenneth Pennell III. And so, as you can see, all these legacy names are coming on down. So Kendrick is named after them. And of course, his middle name, Edward, is after my mother's father, who was Deacon Edward Simon Farmer. And so given all of that, as you can see, you probably like completely blanked out on on the family tree there, but just know that there are multiple names in the family. And so when I read this article, it was so cool to me, frankly. I didn't see it as trendy necessarily, but this article in the Atlantic was called "The Women Naming Their Babies After Themselves." And so I remember how interesting it was for Serena Williams' oldest daughter to be named after her father as a junior, which I thought was really interesting, but yet doable, right? But then when this article came up where women are like, hey, I'm naming her after me. So if it is Lisa Inkerfield Jr., then do not be surprised because we're not surprised when men do it all the time, right? And so I just appreciated the article, Lisa, and I'm curious to think about aloud with you what this means now for gender equity broadly. Because again, the names of my sons, that they're accepted and normal because we were thinking in a patrilineal way. But once something like this comes up where it's Lisa Jr. that interrupts that pattern of thought, who's going to push back against that? And frankly, somebody's going to try to push back against something that's really not their purview or their business. So what do you think, Lisa?
It's so interesting because there's also an international piece here, or rather a US UK division, I guess. So I think the article for me, it's like an aha moment in a way, right? Because it is uncovering the way that the patriarchy is operating that I'd never really thought about. Because whenever I think about people who have the nickname Junior or they're blankety blank Junior, I can only conjure up boys and men, right? Like never girls, right? So even thinking about a girl with a nickname Junior feels weird to me, right? Because it's just not like it's not done. And so this is just again when you think about like in a heterosexual marriage, right? The woman is taking the name of the man, and that's a signifier of ownership. And that you can say it's romantic or whatever, but that is what it means. That is the father is giving away the woman to the man in a heterosexual marriage, and the woman is taking the name of the man, right? So I see that very similarly in this passing down the male name. But the international piece that kind of stuck out to me when you were talking, it's less about gender, but it's more about like I think I may have mentioned this to you before actually. If someone is called Charles Gold III, That to me says aristocracy, says wealth, says someone who has like a landed title of some kind from my like British historical perspective, versus kind of the meaning that you ascribe to it in your family, right? So there's like this piece going on for me that's like gender aha, but also like that's so interesting. Like, I don't know anyone in the UK. I mean, that doesn't mean they don't exist, but I don't know anyone outside of like a very rich, wealthy person who might be like a duke or something. Not that they're not my friend. I don't know those people. Like, I do not, hang out and have tea with those people. But, um, yeah, I don't know any juniors. Like, I don't know anyone who's referred to as blankety blank senior, like, or the second, the third. Like, I don't know anyone like that in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That is so interesting. Well, and I even thought it was interesting when my good friend Nancy Red, who I just adore, she was on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and was
Oh my
also,
gosh.
yeah, she did all these things. She gave the money back to her high school. So
Wow.
yeah, so the winnings could go towards kids that were applying to college, all these different things. She ended up being top 10 at Miss America, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason why I bring her up was because, as my good friend, she has a son and a daughter. Her daughter is also named Nancy Red. It's a family name, but she didn't go with the junior, right? Which I thought was so interesting. But even naming after oneself, beyond the middle name, my middle name is several generations down as well, that I share with my family. But it would very rarely, if ever, be a Nancy Red Jr. or a Lynette Farmer Jr., my mother's middle name and her maiden name. So all of that combined is like, this is a great interruption. And I like interruptions like this because it really
Yes.
makes us
Yes.
stop and think why we do what we do. Lisa, we haven't gotten into it on this podcast yet. Let's punt this over to another pod. But even thinking about some of the name changes that we could have interrupted that we didn't. Like, in hindsight, I
Mm-hmm.
might not have changed my name or added a last name in hindsight. Yet I still want to share my name with my son. So how do I do that? Well, like, you would never turn around and name an opposite gender. I know that's binary, so forgive me, I'm trying to fumble through this live. um, an opposite or differently gendered child by the mother's name. Like, I couldn't envision naming Trey Shaunna Payne Gold Jr. or the second. You see what I mean? So
Mm.
even with Alexis Ohanian Jr., that's opposite or different gender parent child with the same name. So we can barely envision that, much less matrilineally. So all of this is so confusing. Let me just stop talking from here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, like because we are so entrenched in the way we think about naming and gender, as this
Yes,
kind of
yes.
fixed. The idea that Trey could be called Shauna just doesn't. It just and he could, right? But in a culture that polices and disciplines young people who have non-gender conforming names, right?
That's right.
Outside of some of the kind of quote unquote gender neutral names like Alex, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, then you
Mm-hmm.
worry. I mean, there's that whole song, Johnny Cash song, right? About like my dad named me Sue or something. And
Mm-hmm.
he gets bullied his whole life because he has a name Sue.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's just ludicrous, right? To think about how stringent and regimented we get over a name rather than
Mm-hmm.
passing down that maternal familial line. Um,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
so if Trey had been a girl, a cisgender girl,
Mm-hmm.
would Trey have been Shauna the second?
Well, I would tell you for a fact, absolutely not. And I would also tell you that we brainstormed girls' names, and even with that, we were brainstorming girls' names from the women in our families.
Mm.
So, so the boy's aunt, her initials are. EAM Gold. So EAM Gold. So we were trying to get the names at least with the initials. And so my great great grandmother's name was Elizabeth, so we were going to go with Elizabeth or Evelyn. A for Ava, because that's a family name. M for Marie, which was a family name. So we were trying to get it to go there, but never in a gazillion years did it cross our mind to name anyone after me. I don't care.
Right.
But
Yeah.
it wasn't a default as strongly as it was a default with the men in the family, which
Yeah.
I find so predictable yet interesting at the very same time. But no, never would have thought of my name at all.
Yeah, and then like with the second or the third or the fourth, I think that's also tied to property and the way that property or money passes down,
Oh, for
right? Because
sure.
historically it's passed down through the male
Mm-hmm.
line, and so
Mm-hmm.
why would you be Shaunna Payne the fourth, right? When
Right.
historically there's not been property or money that has passed down through that maternal or matrilineal
Yeah, because
patriarch, if that's the
there's
way to
no
say it.
benefit to
Yeah,
that. There's no
right.
benefit to the passing on of a woman's name or a matrilineal name.
Right.
There's no benefit to it at all. Think about exactly what you
Mm-hmm.
just mentioned, passing on land or property. Whereas for women, at a certain point in this country, we weren't able to even get a credit card or get a bank account without the signature of whoever's the closest man or male relative in the family. So there would be no benefit to having Shaunna Jr., Shaunna the Fifth. There would be no benefit to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
All right.
interesting stuff.
Well, definitely stuff. Hopefully, we have disrupted or interrupted some of your patterns of thinking around naming people in your family or people that you know. So, all
Absolutely.
right. So let's shift into phase two here. We've got kind of a bumper phase two. I just got a lot to cover in 10 minutes. We'll see. We'll see how this goes. Um, there's a lot of DEI anniversaries that are happening this year, and so we wanted to have an opportunity to highlight some of them for you and just talk briefly about them. So the first one is Brown versus the Board of Education, which is a 1954 case that declared that separate is inherently unequal. And that led to desegregation, although not as quickly as the Supreme Court would have liked. And so it's the 70th anniversary of that case, 70 years, which feels like a long time, but then also not, right? When you think about, like, when people are talking about the fact that we are kind of in a post-racial world after the election of President Barack Obama and racism is not a thing anymore. And then you're like, well, actually, Brown versus the board and the kind of judicial mandate to desegregate schools was like only 70 years ago. I mean, that's less than a single person's lifetime, given how much people are living these days.
Yeah, that was my mom's generation. Like I think I've
Mm-hmm.
shared before. There. Lisa, you know this, but maybe our listeners aren't aware of this. So the year or the moment that a decision like this comes down, that does not mean people start acting right in that very moment. Okay, it can take years for this to actually take hold, especially in the Deep South and other areas. And so the year May 1954 was not the year that my mother was kind of promoted to a senior in high school, but by the time it was kicking in Southern Virginia, my mother was becoming a senior. So she went to a fully segregated K through 11 experience. And then her senior year of high school was her first year in an integrated high school, which eventually became my high school, Alta Vista High School. And so my mother will be very clear with you around, yes, this is what the history books say, but this is actually how it was experienced. So even, for example, Lisa, you and I have talked about this before, where uh, you know, up until that point, my mother was able to participate in all types of extracurricular activities. And if she wanted to be a cheerleader, a majorette, whatever she wanted to do, she was fully accepted to do so. During the integration year, which is a really sucky time to integrate and go through change management in general in your last year of high school, yeah, you go to school, but you take your behind back home because you're not really accepted on the cheerleading squad or accepted in the band. And so um, this gap between when things become real is very interesting to me. And I had not thought of it that way until I had those conversations with my mom. And she pulled up her yearbook from her segregated high school because she didn't have a senior yearbook for her integrated high school. So things like that came up that just, it's the reality of the implementation of it that just doesn't fly. And on top of
Right.
all the Brown v. Board stuff, then we got George Floyd reflections that are going on where the
Mm-hmm.
world
Mm-hmm.
has returned back to normal, right, Lisa? And I'm telling y'all, Lisa had her crystal ball and she was looking inside in the future. In 2020, she said exactly this stuff was going to happen. And it's truth. People have forgotten about a lot of things that were, how can I say, ignited or at least empowered, quickened by George Floyd's murder. A lot of that stuff is long gone, just long gone,
Yeah. Yeah, I was
long
thinking
gone.
about this today on my dog walk. That's in sport, especially where you and I kind of began this podcasting journey. There was such a huge push to do a better job, particularly with sports that were, dominated by predominantly white people, to change that reality, to change the way the sport looks. And I just feel like that's just disappeared, right? I mean, it's just, you know, forgotten. And so these sports are carrying on, and there may have been some change, but there's not the commitment that we saw in 2020. It was just, what is that, ephemeral, right? It just
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
disappeared. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's just not there. The president of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, he released this statement. And let me share with you all really quickly. 3 years ago today, George Floyd was murdered by uniformed police officers. This must be something that they reposted because it's actually 4 years, y'all. As of today, as of this
Yeah,
year, rather.
be a repost.
Yeah, it must be a repost. Floyd's death ignited a wave of protests and demonstrations against systemic racism around the world and sparked long overdue discussions on racial justice in the United States. In the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, Black Americans continue to grapple with countless injustices as a consequence of a broken law enforcement system and the fear that comes with just being Black in America. Now more than ever, police accountability remains a top priority. Black America won't wait any longer. The fundamental change we demand is no longer an option, but imperative. And until we see the passage of comprehensive police reform, like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act from the last Congress, we know that innocent lives will continue to be at risk, end quote. So, with all of that, you're right. Like, what's going on here, Lisa? I mean, is there any palatable
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
improvement or movement, or are we recoiling back? And I would suggest recoiling back to way, 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 way back before George Floyd, given the tsunami of anti-DEI
Yeah.
legislation across this country. I'm like,
Yeah.
good gracious.
Oh yeah, I think you're totally right there. And it's there has been some shifts in policing, but I would say in the scheme of things, pretty minimal. I mean, there are some places,
Mm-hmm.
Denver included, that have implemented co-responder teams or mental health responder teams. There are some cities where they're kind of getting rid of low-level traffic stops, like they're no longer going to
Mm-hmm.
be not necessarily a crime, but not something you pull people over for. And then there's
Mm-hmm.
some other kind of funding changes, but nothing like what was kind of envisioned in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, yeah, am I disappointed? Am I surprised? Not surprised, a little bit disappointed, I guess, because even if I had a future prediction back then that it wouldn't last. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just I don't want to be right. I don't want either one of us to be right about this, but
No.
unfortunately we are. And so it's kind of this. So imagine the perfect storm, y'all. We have Brown v. Board, the
Mhm.
70th anniversary of that, the 4-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder, along with countless others that were also murdered
Right.
in that very
Right.
same year, including our Asian siblings and all of that. Um, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is mind blowing to me because I feel like human rights are just recoiling right back with everything else. And then
Yeah.
the super election year, where we have 60 plus elections going on around the world for presidents or other very high senior level roles
Yeah.
in their various countries. This is just a big conflation of OMG right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of those elections, including the US, the stakes are pretty high because of kind of the rise of populism, as it is stated, but really authoritarianism in the vein of populism.
Mm-hmm,
That
mm-hmm,
is that
mm-hmm.
is concerning. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is just, I mean, the fact that it's the 75th anniversary and we have so many human rights violations going on around the world right now is very
Mm-hmm.
dispiriting. And you know, as an aside, like the United States doesn't actually sign on to the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice because it
Mm-hmm.
didn't want an external um, entity interfering in its jurisdiction, which you can basically read as it didn't want to be held accountable for any kind of war crimes or crimes against humanity that its military personnel would do overseas. That is definitely a conversation for another pod, but that's pretty interesting when you have a government that is articulating a position in support of human rights globally, but then, on the down low is, undercutting that. And this is the 75th year. Um, and we talked about this before, the Rwanda law in the UK that's
Yes,
going to like load up planes of migrants who are fleeing persecution
yes,
and send them off to
yes.
Rwanda. And that, Rishi Sunak, the prime minister there, was just going to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. And you're just like, yeah, it's a backsliding, right? Book banning, DEI banning, like abuse against migrants, like just, yeah,
Mm-hmm,
it's not
mm-hmm.
funny. Like I'm laughing in exasperation. It's not funny at all.
Oh, absolutely. Laughing in frustration. I'm like, enough already. Yeah, yeah, I'm with you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. I'm at a loss. Usually I try to give people answers to questions and concerns. But in this case, I just want people to hold how we are noting how many years it's been since major
Mm-hmm.
decisions about
Yeah.
human rights in general have occurred, all while it's reversing itself. So it almost feels like,
Yeah.
Lisa, when gosh, I'm thinking about in Tour de France where they have those hairpin turns where it looks like they're turning back on themselves. That's like the
Yeah.
visual I'm getting as I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at all these anniversaries, that yeah, we were going in one direction, but now we're facing ourselves going right back
Yep.
to where we came from. Infuriating.
Yeah.
Infuriating.
Yeah. That's a really great visual. So
We might have to
on
use
that
that for the cover of this
really
pod.
uplifting note, let's move on. We might. We
Oh,
might. Let's move on to phase three.
yes, yes. So let's talk about phase three, because our phase three of the pod is coming from another pod that I was listening to, where there is a wonderful podcast that Lovey Ajayi Jones has revitalized, where this season she's talking about how her business, her small business as an author, as a speaker, almost went bankrupt. She was 3 months away from bankrupt. And so she's being very candid about her experiences. And so I won't get into all the details on that. I can provide you a link. But what I thought was really interesting about her processing this almost falling apart of her business was that she was talking about her team and how it was so exasperating for her team to, on one hand, complain about how much work they have to do and they need to be more productive, yet at the same time they were using almost every team meeting, staff meeting, group meeting as work therapy, which I thought was so fascinating. I'm like, really? People do this? Because maybe I'm just cold hearted, but when I go to work, like when I was working for a university, when I was working for someone other than myself, I'm like, damn it, Who cares how you feel right now? Did you get this done or not? And it's not to be cold-hearted or inhumane, as we were just talking about humanity, all of it. But I'm very action-oriented. Let's get it done. And then once we get it done, I'm going to circle back to your feelings. That's just my approach. I understand that. That's probably a very Gen X approach too. But when I read this particular this definition of work therapy, because I was like, what is that? Is it like a real word, or is this, like a turn of phrase someone's using it? And so the American Psychological Association actually has a definition for work therapy. It's the use of compensated or uncompensated work activities as a therapeutic agent for individuals, stop right there, with mental or physical disorders. And then they give the example of self-esteem or interpersonal or cognitive skills may be enhanced when these individuals function in a safe, controlled environment where they may either acquire fundamental training for new skills or receive retraining in skills that have been lost or diminished. Now, I wasn't expecting this, Lisa. I was not expecting that this definition would turn itself on its head by saying another hairpin turn. It's turning on itself because I'm thinking, oh my goodness, the entire work world who is experiencing work therapy or even celebrating work therapy may be celebrating this in such a way that it was not meant to be celebrated to begin with, because it sounds like by definition, work therapy was for individuals, employees, workers with mental or physical disorders. But now what we're saying is that we're just going to co-opt this thing and everybody gets to use it. So let's all vent, let's all do all these other soft skill, emotional intelligence, empathy work in the workplace that actually was created for an entirely different and already stigmatized, ostracized, excluded group. Help me, Lisa. Help me to figure this out.
It didn't drop until you read it out loud again, and I was listening. I was like, so this is different, right? This is using work as a tool of therapy for people to gain skills and increased self-esteem, versus I go to Shaunna's office because I need a vent about something. And Shaunna's so wise and supportive that there is actually for the people listening, she made a face. So that I feel like I've had a little bit of a therapy session, right? So I didn't even know about the existence of work as a tool of therapeutic intervention for people with disabilities, whether that's mental illness or physical disabilities. Like, I didn't even know that was a thing. But my experience of what I would understand work therapy is what you're saying is the co-optation, right? Is that we are taking staff meetings, or I am going into Shaunna's office to vent and talk through a problem because I'm stressed out, I'm emotionally taxed. And so I understand that behavior to exist mostly in toxic workspaces, right? Like, my work is so overwhelming and the culture is so toxic that it's really hard for me to get things done, and I constantly need to process. So it's interesting because I think the podcast was referencing that second one, right? It wasn't referencing this therapeutic intervention tool. It was saying that nothing was getting done because every group meeting ended up being like a group therapy session.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Not too much was getting done. And so I thought that was interesting. And at the same time, I appreciate how we also had already been talking about this concept of covering, Lisa, which I think is still fascinating in and of itself. When you can't be yourself at work, maybe that does loop us all the way back to, here we go with another hairpin turn, where we're going back to code switching, where people feel that they can't be themselves. So they either, well, how can I say? Maybe covering is one end of the spectrum and work therapy is the opposite, where are you being too much of yourself? Like, I'm thinking about when it comes to work therapy, a lot of people have thrown around flippantly words like, TMI, too much information. I don't need to know all that. Just do your job. wipe your tears somewhere else, gripe, complain somewhere else, but you are here to work, not to process your feelings. That's one direction, but yet at the same time, similar to code switching, I'm wondering how many people are covering
Mm-hmm.
around us and we're not aware. And when they stop covering, that results in work therapy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because of the emotional toll, right? Like it's stressful to have to put on a show or put on a mask, I guess, which
Absolutely.
is, and the code switching is the flipping backwards and forwards between two or three things within the same time frame, whereas covering is like more of a kind of, for the whole workday, Lisa is someone else, Shaunna is someone else, because we don't feel like we can be ourselves. So that's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely going to create emotional stress that then you might want to work out either with a therapist
Mm-hmm.
outside of work or perhaps with someone in your workplace
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because they understand the unique dynamics of that workplace. Would I
Mm-hmm.
do that in a group session? Like that would have to mean that all 5 or 6 people who I'm having that work meeting with would all have to have some
Mm.
window into the covering or the toxic work culture, right? And I don't know that I would. I think I've only ever engaged in what might be considered this new definition of work therapy one on one, or maybe with 2
Ah,
people. I don't think
yeah,
I've ever
yeah.
done it in a group setting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now that's interesting. Well, now what really got me about the covering piece too was that everyone does it, including white men, which I thought was fascinating. So if you got over half of white men, it said 54% of white men surveyed said that they also cover. And then this notion of covering by proxy, meaning that they're covering on behalf of someone else. So, for example, I'm thinking of someone right now that would fit this definition entirely, where this person has a transgender child and they don't advocate for the rights of transgender people at all, because they have a reputation to uphold in their field, in their industry. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just telling you what I'm observing. And so, given that, I'm like, oh, this is very interesting how the covering shows up. Um, and I guess what I'm saying with that whole white men piece of covering is that it's almost like the best of the worst, if you will, where most, if not all, people cover to some extent, but white men may cover the least out of all of the groups. And
Yeah.
those who are most marginalized cover the most.
Yeah, I think that's right because workplaces in general are built for white men, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
they are likely to experience the most comfort as a group in the workplace. But that doesn't mean
Uh-huh.
that universally they aren't covering because of something, some personality trait or some deficiency they
Mm-hmm.
perceive that they have, right? Feeling like I could see it manifesting like, well, I'm a white dude and I have to behave in a certain way in this workplace because that's an expectation of me. So I'm going to kind of
Mm-hmm.
perform. But
Mm-hmm.
actually, what I would like to do is go hang out with my friends and have a
Mm-hmm.
cup of tea and,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
talk
Oh
about
yeah.
knitting, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, and I think what's really interesting too is that, the article that you and I found on covering, it covers a 10-year gap. So Yoshino, who originally wrote the book Uncovering, in 2006, well, there was an update to the study in 2013, and the data still bears out that folks are still doing the same thing after that many years, if not worse. I'm like, whoa, okay, so we have not seen any improvement in that area. Thank you very much.
Well, and it just goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about in the previous phase, and that there hasn't been a significant change in workplaces that have created the conditions where people, no matter their identities, feel like they can be themselves, right? Like,
Mm,
so people are still performing, covering, code switching, all of those different behaviors. So
mm-hmm,
even
mm-hmm,
with a renewed commitment in 2020 to address implicit bias that exists in the workplace and other spaces, we're still seeing a massive number of people not feeling like they can be their true selves, and so behaving in a way that they perceive to be more acceptable, presumably, in their workplace.
Yeah. And I think I'm trying to figure out the language to describe it, but I think the the culprit is going back to our usual analogy about lots of different systems like anti-racism, racism, all those things. Remember when we talked about before, Lisa, around it's hard to jump in a pool and not get wet when it comes to being an anti-racist, where some racism is going to make you wet in some form. You're going to touch it. You might literally be immersed in it. You might absorb it, right? I feel like the same thing is happening with toxic work environments that were built for certain people many, 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 many years ago, is that we all have to jump into it every single day when we go to work. So it's almost impossible to come out of that pool and not have the toxicity on us. So the question is, Lisa and I will answer this question in the next 2 minutes. How do we what's the opposite of toxic? How do we create a healthy work environment? We'll figure that out in the next few minutes. Right now.
Oh
Right now.
yeah, right. That's how we're going to make our billions, right there, because we have the answer to that question. Yeah.
Hello. Exactly. Exactly.
um yeah, so I mean, I'm only associating all this with kind of unhealthy, uninclusive, perhaps
Mm-hmm.
toxic work environments, but I imagine some of this phenomena exists in slightly healthier spaces because there is perhaps a groupthink that happens around being dissatisfied with
Yeah.
what's on your plate, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, which is what I think Lovey was getting at in her podcast, right? So we've strayed a little bit from that, but I do think it's
Uh-huh.
interesting to think about these dynamics. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and you're reminding me of a conversation I just had with a very good friend who would deem their work environment as extremely healthy. Yet
Mm-hmm.
there are some areas of covering that were being shared with me about religion, for example, like,
Okay. Okay.
no, we are not talking about religion in any form at all here, even though everything else is quite lovely. And in fact, in over 30 years of work experience, this is the most healthy environment that I've ever worked in, and we're still not going to talk about those topics. So I think you're right to a degree.
Yeah.
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 Mm-hmm. Yep. So
Well, okay. This phase went on a bit longer, and I think we pulled on some threads there that we weren't anticipating we would be pulling on. But let's wrap it up for this week, and maybe we need to revisit this
exactly,
in another episode. But
exactly.
in the meantime, where can folks find us, Shaunna?
Well, you all know you can find us everywhere. You can find us on YouTube, on Unfazed Unedited. Go ahead and subscribe. So anything that we drop there, it'll give you an alert. Just click the bell and you'll find it there. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Instagram, LinkedIn. That's where you get the goodies in regards to the articles that we use that inspire our phases. So go to LinkedIn. You can also email us too at info@unfazedpodcast.com. And of course, we have our website that has all the things, unfazedpodcast.com, where you can access old and new shows. And of course, if you like this week's episode, please continue to like, subscribe, leave a review, and also share with your friends, coworkers, or others in this phase of your life. So until next time.
See you next time.